The day they came for his daughter, he didn't beg, he didn't scream, he didn't fight. Instead, he made an offer that silenced everyone. "Take me," he said. "Sell me, chain me, do whatever you want, but let her go." And in that moment, a father gave up his freedom so his little girl could have hers. Part 1A. The Price of a Father's Love. The plantation yard smelled of dust and fear. It was auction day. Men in long coats stood near the wooden platform, their boots pressing into the dry earth. Women clutched their children tightly. Some prayed, some wept, others stared into nothing, already broken. And in the middle of it all stood Samuel Carter. He was tall, strong, and known across the plantation for his quiet endurance. He rarely spoke more than necessary, but when he did, his voice carried weight. Beside him, holding tightly to his hand, was his 8-year-old daughter, Lila. She had her mother's eyes, wide, curious, innocent. Too innocent for a world like this. Samuel felt her fingers trembling in his palm. "Papa, why are they looking at us like that?" she whispered. He swallowed hard. "Don't be afraid," he said softly. "I'm right here." But he knew something she didn't. Her name was on the list. The plantation owner had fallen into debt. Crops had failed, money was short. And when money was short, lives became currency. Children were easier to sell. They brought good prices. They were investments. Samuel had heard the whispers the night before. Lila would be sold to a buyer from the south, far away, far enough that he would never see her again. He hadn't slept, not even for a moment. All night he had watched her breathing beside him in their small cabin. He memorized every detail, the way her hair curled near her ear, the tiny scar on her wrist from when she fell near the river, the soft rhythm of her breath. He knew morning would try to steal her, and he would not let that happen. When the auction began, names were called one by one. Families were separated in seconds. A mother collapsed screaming as her teenage son was dragged away. A husband reached for his wife, only to be struck down with the back of a rifle. Lila squeezed his hand tighter each time someone cried out. Then it happened. "Lila Carter!" the auctioneer shouted. The world went silent for Samuel. Lila looked up at him. "Papa?" He knelt down quickly, holding her shoulders. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was breaking. "No matter what happens, you are brave, you are strong, and you are loved. Do you understand?" Her lip trembled. "Are you coming with me?" He didn't answer, because he hadn't decided yet how far he was willing to go. But when a tall man with a dark hat stepped forward and examined Lila like she was livestock, something inside Samuel snapped. The man grabbed her chin, turning her face left and right. "She's healthy. Good teeth, strong bones. I'll start at—" "Stop." The single word cut through the air like a blade. Everyone turned. Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between the buyer and his daughter. "You want value? Take me instead." Murmurs spread across the yard. The auctioneer frowned. "That's not how this works." Samuel's voice didn't shake. "I'm stronger. I can plow fields, lift timber, break horses. I'll earn you more than she ever could." The buyer studied him carefully. "And why would you do that?" the man asked. Samuel looked down at Lila. "Because she deserves a life, not chains." Silence. Heavy, tense, dangerous. The plantation owner stepped forward. "You'd sell yourself?" he asked. Samuel didn't hesitate. "Yes." The owner smirked slightly. "Double price," he told the buyer. "He's one of my best workers." The buyer considered, then nodded. "Done." Lila didn't understand at first. She just saw her father kneel and hold her face gently. "Papa?" she whispered again. Samuel forced a smile. "You're going somewhere safe. You're going to live, and one day you're going to be free." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I don't want to go without you." His heart shattered, but he kept his voice strong. "You won't be without me," he said, placing his hand over her chest. "I'll always be right here." She threw her arms around him, sobbing. Men moved forward with chains.
Samuel stood tall as they wrapped iron around his wrists. He did not fight. He did not look back, because if he looked back, he might not survive the pain. As the buyer led Lila in the opposite direction, she kept turning, trying to see him. "Papa!" she screamed. That sound, that one word, it carved itself into Samuel's soul. He watched her grow smaller in the distance until she disappeared beyond the trees, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely powerless. But beneath the grief, a promise burned. This was not the end. He had given himself up for her freedom, but freedom wasn't just escape. Freedom was reunion, and somewhere deep inside, Samuel made a vow. He would survive, no matter what they did to him, no matter where they took him. He would survive long enough to find her again. The chains tightened as they forced him onto a wagon headed south. The sun was setting behind the plantation. The last light of day faded over the only home he had ever known. And as darkness swallowed the road ahead, Samuel Carter closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in preparation. Because a father's love does not end at sacrifice. Sometimes that's where the real fight begins. The wagon carrying Samuel Carter rolled for 2 full days before it reached the new plantation. The chains around his wrists had rubbed his skin raw, but he barely felt the pain anymore. Physical suffering was simple. It had limits. It could be measured. What he felt inside was different. It had no edges, no end. Every mile that separated him from Leela felt like another piece of his heart being torn away. He kept replaying her face in his mind, the way her small fingers clung to him, the way her voice cracked when she called him Papa. That single word echoed inside him louder than the rattling chains. When they finally arrived, the plantation looked harsher than the one he had left behind. The land stretched endlessly, dry and unforgiving. The overseer who greeted the new arrivals had cold eyes and a scar running from his ear down to his jaw. This was not a place where mercy existed. Samuel was pushed forward and inspected like an animal. His arms were lifted, his shoulders pressed, his teeth examined. The overseer seemed satisfied. "This one's strong," he said. "Put him in the south fields, hard labor." Samuel didn't resist. He didn't speak. He had chosen this fate. Now he would endure it. The south fields were brutal. The work started before sunrise and didn't end until darkness swallowed the sky. The heat burned the skin. The cotton tore at their fingers. Water was scarce. Rest was shorter than a breath. Any mistake was punished quickly and publicly. The first time Samuel stumbled from exhaustion, the overseer's whip cracked across his back without warning. The pain exploded through his body, but he forced himself not to cry out. He would not give them that satisfaction. That night, lying on the wooden floor of the quarters, his body trembling from pain, he stared at the ceiling and thought of Leela. He imagined her somewhere under the same sky, maybe looking at the same stars. He wondered if she was scared, if she was hungry, if she cried herself to sleep. That thought nearly broke him. But then something else rose inside him, not despair, but resolve. He had not sold himself just for her to survive. He had sold himself to give her a future, and a future meant more than distance. It meant freedom. Weeks passed. Samuel learned the rhythms of the plantation. He observed the guards, counted their patrol steps, noted which ones drank too much and which ones paid attention. He watched the wagons that came and went. He listened to whispers among the workers. There were stories, dangerous stories. Stories of people escaping north, of hidden routes through forests, of churches that offered shelter, of coded songs that carried secret messages. Most people were too afraid to believe them. Hope was risky. Hope could get you killed. But Samuel had already risked everything. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned orange, a new group of enslaved workers arrived from a neighboring plantation. Transfers happened occasionally when labor was needed elsewhere. Samuel kept his head down, pretending not to care, but his heart pounded violently in his chest. He searched faces carefully without drawing attention, and then he heard it. A laugh, soft, familiar, slightly uneven, like it always had been when she got too excited. His breath stopped.
He lifted his eyes slowly. Across the yard, struggling to lift a water bucket far too heavy for her thin arms, was Leela. She looked smaller than he remembered, thinner. Her clothes hung loosely around her shoulders, but it was her, alive, close enough that he could see the curve of her cheek. Samuel felt the world tilt beneath him. For a moment he might collapse. All the months of pain, of fear, of wondering, and she was here, on the same soil. He forced himself to look away quickly. If anyone noticed his reaction, questions would follow. Questions could bring punishment. That night, he barely slept. How had she ended up here? Had the buyer sold her again? Had the plantation debts shifted ownership? It didn't matter. What mattered was this. Fate had given him something impossible, a second chance. The next morning, as workers were lined up for assignments, Samuel maneuvered himself into a position closer to her group. He didn't speak, he didn't look at her directly, but when she passed near him, carrying a sack nearly half her size, he whispered so quietly it was almost air. "Leela." She froze. Her eyes widened slowly as she turned her head. For a second she simply stared, as if her mind refused to believe what her eyes were seeing. "Papa?" she breathed. The overseer barked a command from across the field, forcing them to move. Samuel lowered his head immediately. "Not now," he murmured. "Be strong." All day, Samuel worked harder than ever before, because now pain had purpose. Every strike of his hands against the soil, every step under the blazing sun, every drop of sweat, it was no longer survival, it was preparation. That night, when darkness covered the plantation and the guards retreated to their posts, Samuel managed to slip near the edge of the quarters where the children were kept. Leela was sitting alone, knees pulled to her chest. When she saw him approach, tears filled her eyes instantly. "I thought I'd never see you again," she whispered, trying not to cry too loudly. Samuel knelt in front of her and placed his rough hands gently on her shoulders. "I told you," he said, "you're never without me." She touched the scar forming on his wrist from the chains. "They hurt you," she said. He smiled faintly. "Pain is nothing." She shook her head. "I was so scared." "I know," he replied, "but you're brave, braver than you think." For a long moment they simply looked at each other, memorizing faces all over again. He noticed how much she had changed. Childhood was fading too quickly from her features. "Listen to me carefully," he finally said. "We're not staying here." Her eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "We're leaving," he whispered. "Together." Fear flickered across her face. "They'll catch us." "Not if we're careful." He told her what he had learned, about the patrol schedules, about the river that ran north beyond the tree line, about the whispers of safe houses. "It won't be easy," he said, "and it will be dangerous, but staying here is not living." She nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "When?" she asked. "Soon," he replied. "Very soon." Over the next few days, Samuel began preparing quietly. He saved small pieces of bread, watched which nights the guards were most distracted, counted the seconds between lantern patrols. Every move had to be perfect. One mistake would cost more than punishment. It would cost everything. On the fourth night, heavy clouds covered the sky, hiding the moon. Darkness wrapped the plantation in thick shadow. The wind picked up, carrying dust and noise that masked small sounds. Samuel knew this was their chance. He slipped into the children's quarters and gently shook Leela awake. "It's time," he whispered. Her heart pounded so loudly he could feel it through her small hand. They moved quietly toward the tree line, keeping low, using shadows as protection. Every crack of a twig felt like thunder. Every distant shout made their blood freeze. Halfway across the open field, a lantern light swung suddenly in their direction. Samuel pulled Leela down in the tall grass, pressing her close against the earth. The guard paused. For a long, terrifying moment, the light hovered dangerously near them. Samuel held his breath. If they were seen now, there would be no second chance. The lantern finally moved away. Samuel exhaled slowly. They reached the trees and disappeared into the darkness beyond the plantation. Leela looked up at him, her face pale but determined. "Where do we go now?" she asked. Samuel stared north into the endless forest. "Forward," he said. Behind them, the plantation bell suddenly rang. They had been discovered. Dogs began barking in the distance. Voices shouted. The hunt had started. Samuel tightened his grip on Leela's hand. He had sold himself once to save her. Now he would risk everything, again, to keep her free.
Branches clawed at their clothes as Samuel pulled Leela deeper into the darkness. Behind them, the plantation bell continued ringing like a warning to the night itself. Dogs barked wildly, and angry voices cut through the wind. "They won't stop," Leela whispered, trying to keep her breathing steady. "No," Samuel replied quietly. "They won't." But neither would he. The forest floor was uneven, roots twisting like traps beneath their feet. Samuel moved quickly but carefully, making sure Leela stayed close behind him. Every sound felt magnified, the snap of a twig, the rush of wind through leaves, the pounding of their hearts. After nearly half an hour of running, Samuel slowed. He knelt and pressed his ear to the ground. Hooves. Dogs. They were tracking. He quickly pulled Leela toward a shallow creek cutting through the trees. "Step only where I step," he instructed. They entered the cold water, moving upstream to break their scent. The icy current numbed their feet, but Samuel welcomed the discomfort. Pain meant they were still ahead. Leela stumbled once, nearly falling, but Samuel caught her instantly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You're doing perfect," he told her. "Just keep going." After several minutes, they climbed out on the opposite bank and moved again through thicker brush. Samuel began brushing branches behind them to hide broken paths. Every small detail mattered. The barking grew louder. Too loud. "They're close," Leela said, fear creeping into her voice. Samuel's jaw tightened. He had expected this. Plantation owners did not lose property without a fight, and to them, that's what he and Leela were. Property. He spotted a fallen tree ahead and quickly guided Leela underneath its hollow center. He covered the entrance partially with loose branches. "Stay still," he whispered, "no matter what you hear." She nodded, clutching his shirt tightly. Moments later, lantern light flickered through the trees. Boots crushed leaves nearby. Dogs sniffed wildly. One of them stopped directly in front of the fallen tree. Samuel's heart slammed against his ribs so hard he thought it might give them away. The dog barked sharply. A man stepped closer, raising his lantern. "Got something?" the overseer's voice called from behind. The dog barked again. Samuel tightened his arm around Leela, ready to fight if he had to. He had no weapon, no advantage, but he would not let them take her again. The dog suddenly yelped. Another hunter cursed. "It's just a rabbit trail. Move!" The lantern light shifted away. Boots faded. The barking drifted deeper into the forest, in the wrong direction. Samuel waited another full minute before moving. Only when silence truly settled did he slowly guide Leela out. She was shaking. "You were so brave," he whispered. She looked up at him. "I thought they were going to find us." "So did I," he admitted. "But they hadn't. Not yet." They continued north until exhaustion forced them to stop. The sky began lightening with early dawn, painting the trees in pale gray. Samuel knew daylight made them more visible, but continuing blindly while tired was more dangerous. He found a small hidden dip between thick bushes and settled Leela there. "Rest," he told her. "What about you?" "I'll watch." She curled against him, and within minutes, exhaustion pulled her into sleep. Samuel didn't close his eyes. Instead, he thought. They had maybe a day's head start if luck stayed on their side, but they needed food, water, direction. He remembered whispers from the plantation about a river north that led toward free states. If they could reach it, they could follow it. Water meant fewer tracks, but it was at least 2 days away on foot. 2 days of being hunted. When Leela woke, the sun was higher. "Are we free?" she asked softly. Samuel hesitated. "Not yet," he said, "but we're closer than we've ever been." They resumed walking. The forest thickened, branches growing tighter, thorns scraping their skin. Hunger began to bite harder than fear. Samuel managed to find wild berries along the way and tested them carefully before giving any to Leela. "Eat slowly,"
he said. "We don't know when we'll find more." As afternoon turned to evening, clouds gathered overhead. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Rain. It could hide their tracks or make the terrain deadly. The first drops fell just as they reached a steep hill. The ground quickly turned slippery. Leela slipped and slid, scraping her knee badly. She cried out in pain. Samuel immediately lifted her into his arms and carried her the rest of the way up. His muscles screamed, but he refused to slow down. Behind them, faintly through the rain, dogs barked again. "They're still following us," Leela said weakly. "Yes," Samuel said. The rain poured harder, soaking them completely. Mud clung to their legs. Lightning cracked across the sky, briefly illuminating the forest in blinding white flashes. In one of those flashes, Samuel saw something ahead. A small wooden structure near the edge of the trees. A cabin. He didn't know if it was safe, but they couldn't survive the storm exposed. He approached cautiously, placing Leela down behind him. He knocked once. No answer. He pushed the door slightly open. Inside was dim but dry. An elderly woman sat near a small lantern, staring directly at him as if she had been expecting them. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then she said quietly, "You're not the first to pass through here." Samuel didn't lower his guard. "We won't stay long." She studied Leela's injured knee. "The river is still 2 days north," she said calmly. "You won't make it without rest." Samuel's heart pounded. "How do you know about the river?" he asked. The woman's lips curved slightly. "Because I've helped others reach it." Leela looked up at her father hopefully. Samuel hesitated. Trust was dangerous, but so was refusing help. Finally, he stepped inside. The woman closed the door gently behind them. Outside, thunder roared. Inside, for the first time since the escape, there was warmth. But Samuel knew something important. Hunters did not give up easily, and if someone had helped others before, then someone might have betrayed them too. As Leela rested beside the small fire, Samuel stared at the door, listening carefully to the storm, because survival wasn't just about running anymore. It was about knowing who to trust. And somewhere, in the darkness outside, the hunt was far from over.
Rain pounded against the wooden cabin roof, and thunder rolled so loudly it felt as if the sky itself was cracking open. Inside, the small fire flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows along the walls. Leela slept near the hearth, her breathing finally steady after hours of fear and running. The elderly woman who had opened her door to them sat quietly in a rocking chair, her sharp eyes reflecting the firelight. Samuel did not sleep. He stood near the window, peering through a narrow crack in the wood. Every flash of lightning revealed trees bending violently in the wind. Every distant sound made his muscles tense. "You don't trust easily," the woman said calmly, without looking at him. "I can't afford to," Samuel replied. She nodded slightly, as if she understood more than she let on. "That's wise." Samuel turned toward her. "Why help us?" The woman rocked gently. "Because once, a long time ago, someone helped me." Her voice carried weight, not pity, not sympathy, experience. Still, Samuel's instincts remained alert. Hunters were ruthless. Plantation owners sometimes offered rewards to anyone who provided information about escapees. Money could turn kindness into betrayal. "You're safe for tonight," the woman continued, "but when morning comes, you must move fast. They'll spread wider once the storm clears." Samuel glanced at Leela. Mud stained her dress. Her small hands were scratched from thorns. Her knee was bandaged carefully by the old woman, but she was still just a child running through wilderness hunted like prey. Guilt pressed heavily on him. Had he done the right thing? Selling himself had brought him back to her, but escaping had thrown her into another kind of danger. Yet staying would have meant chains forever. There was no painless path, only necessary ones. Before dawn, the woman handed Samuel a small cloth bundle. Inside were pieces of dried bread, a little salted meat, and a folded scrap of paper. "Follow the river north,"
she instructed. "But when you reach the split where it curves west, do not follow the main path. Hunters watch the obvious trails. Take the narrow bend through the marsh. Harder ground, fewer eyes." Samuel studied her carefully. "Why tell me this?" She met his gaze steadily. "Because not every soul in this land has forgotten what humanity looks like." He nodded once. At first light, the storm weakened into a steady rain. Samuel gently woke Leela. "It's time," he whispered. She blinked slowly, then remembered. Fear flickered across her face again, but it was softer now, braver. They stepped outside into damp morning air. The forest smelled fresh, washed clean. Their tracks from the night before were nearly erased. A blessing. They moved quickly north, following the woman's directions. The rain slowed to a mist as hours passed. Samuel kept his ears open, listening for dogs, hooves, shouting, anything unnatural. For a while, there was only forest. Then, just before midday, they reached the river. It stretched wide and steady, moving with quiet determination. Samuel felt something stir inside him at the sight of it. Water meant direction. Water meant hope. "This way," he said, guiding Leela along the riverbank. They walked for hours. Hunger returned. Fatigue deepened. Leela stumbled occasionally, but she refused to complain. "You're stronger than I was at your age," he told her softly. She looked up at him. "I learned from you." The words struck him deeply. He had feared she would remember him only as the man who let himself be chained. Instead, she remembered him as strength. Late in the afternoon, they reached the split in the river, one branch curving west, the other continuing north through thick marshland. Samuel remembered the warning. Hunters watch the obvious trails. The western path looked easier, dry ground, clear tracks. Too easy. He led Leela toward the marsh. The mud sucked at their boots immediately. The ground was uneven, hidden roots waiting beneath shallow water. It was exhausting work, but it concealed footprints better than open soil. Halfway through the marsh, Samuel heard it. Distant shouting. Not ahead, behind. "They found our trail," he muttered. Leela's hand tightened around his. The voices grew louder. Dogs barked again, closer than before. Samuel's heart pounded violently. They were running out of time. He scanned the marsh desperately. To the right, he spotted fallen reeds thick enough to hide inside. To the left, deeper water. "Into the reeds," he whispered urgently. They crouched low, pushing themselves into the wet brush. Mud covered their clothes. Insects buzzed around them. Leela trembled silently, her small body pressed against his. Lantern light flickered at the edge of the marsh. "They came this way," a man shouted. Dogs barked wildly. One hunter stepped closer to the marsh's edge, scanning the muddy ground. Samuel barely breathed. If the dogs caught their scent, everything would end here. A dog lunged forward suddenly, pulling its handler closer to where they hid. Leela's fingers dug into Samuel's arm. The dog barked aggressively. The handler cursed. "Lost the trail in the mud," he growled. Another hunter spat angrily. "They won't get far, not with a child." Samuel felt rage burn inside him at those words. Not with a child. They underestimated her. They underestimated him. After several tense minutes, the hunters began moving along the western path instead, the easier route. Their voices faded gradually. Samuel stayed still for 5 full minutes after silence returned. Only then did he slowly rise. "Are they gone?" whispered Leela. "For now." They pushed forward through the marsh until solid ground finally returned beneath their feet. The sun was beginning to lower again. 2 days of running, 2 days of fear, and they were still not safe. As night approached, Samuel spotted something ahead that made him pause. Smoke, thin, rising through trees. Someone else was nearby. He crouched, pulling Leela down with him. It could be another cabin like the woman's, or it could be hunters setting camp. He needed to know. "Stay here," he whispered. Her eyes widened. "Don't leave me." "I'll be close," he assured her. He moved silently through the trees, careful with every step. As he got closer, he heard quiet voices, not harsh, not aggressive, low, calm. He peered through brush and saw 3 figures sitting near a small, controlled fire, 2 men and a woman. Their clothes were worn, travel-worn, not plantation guards. One of the men noticed movement and stood quickly. "Show yourself," he called quietly. Samuel stepped out slowly, hands raised slightly. "I mean no harm," he said. The woman studied him, then her eyes shifted past him toward where Leela hid. "You're running," she said. "Yes." She nodded toward the river. "North?" "Yes." The second man exchanged a look with her. "You're on the right path," he said. "We're heading the same direction." Samuel hesitated. Trust again. Always risk. But traveling alone with a child was even riskier. "We move at dawn," the woman added. "You and the girl can rest here tonight." Samuel glanced back toward the trees where Leela waited. For the first time since the escape began, he felt something unexpected. Not safety, but possibility. They were no longer alone. He returned for Leela and brought her to the small camp. She stayed close to him but watched the strangers carefully. As they sat near the fire, Samuel kept his posture alert, but inside, something shifted. The journey north was far from over. Hunters still searched, danger still surrounded them, but the road ahead no longer felt impossible, because now it wasn't just survival, it was movement, forward, towards something greater than escape, towards freedom. And as the fire crackled under the open night sky, Samuel realized something powerful. He had sold himself once to save his daughter. Now he was building something far more dangerous to those who hunted them. Hope.
The fire burned low as dawn crept slowly across the sky. Samuel had barely slept. Even surrounded by people who seemed to share the same goal, he could not allow himself full trust. Lila rested against his side, her breathing steady, her small hand still gripping his shirt even in sleep. The other 3 travelers stirred quietly as the first light touched the treetops. The woman who had offered them rest introduced herself as Miriam. The 2 men were brothers, Elijah and Thomas. They had escaped from a plantation farther south weeks ago and had been moving steadily north ever since, following river paths and coded directions left by others before them. "We don't stay in one place long," Miriam explained softly while packing what little food they had. "Hunters move faster than hope sometimes." Samuel nodded. "We move at first light." They began walking as the sun rose higher, staying close to the river but avoiding open ground. The forest had grown thinner in this region, making concealment harder. Samuel stayed slightly behind the group, watching for danger from the rear, while Elijah led the front. For the first few hours, the journey felt almost steady. There were no barking dogs, no shouting voices, just the rhythm of footsteps over damp earth and the distant rush of water. Lila walked beside Miriam, listening carefully as the woman told quiet stories about places north where laws were different, where men and women could work for wages, where children went to school. "School?" Lila asked softly. "Yes," Miriam smiled. "Places where children learn to read and write." Lila glanced back at Samuel, eyes shining with something new, not just hope, but imagination. Samuel felt his chest tighten. That was the future he had envisioned the day he offered himself in her place. A life with choices, a life without chains. But hope could make people careless, and Samuel had survived too much to forget that. By midday, the group reached a narrow wooden bridge crossing a shallow stretch of the river. Elijah paused, studying the structure. "We cross here," he said quietly. Samuel's instincts prickled. The bridge was old but sturdy. However, it sat in open space, surrounded by clear ground on both sides. Crossing would expose them completely. "There's another way," Samuel suggested, "through the water." Thomas shook his head. "Too deep for the girl." Samuel looked at Lila. The river current here was stronger than before. Miriam spoke gently. "We don't have time to debate. If hunters are behind us, open ground won't matter. They'll find us either way." Samuel hesitated, then nodded.
They moved onto the bridge quickly but carefully. The wood creaked under their combined weight. Lila clung tightly to Samuel's hand as they crossed. Halfway over, a sharp crack echoed from behind them. Samuel turned instantly. A rifle shot. The wood near Elijah splintered violently. "Run!" someone shouted. More gunshots rang out from the tree line they had just left. Hunters. They had been tracking quietly. Samuel grabbed Lila and pulled her forward across the bridge as bullets struck the wooden planks. Elijah and Thomas reached the other side first, turning to help the others. Miriam stumbled as another shot hit near her foot. Samuel shoved Lila ahead and reached back, pulling Miriam upright. They sprinted into the trees on the far side just as another bullet tore through the bridge railing. Dogs barked in the distance again. "They were waiting," Thomas gasped. "They knew this crossing." Samuel's mind raced. Someone had told them, or someone had been watching. There was no time to question it now. "Split up," Elijah shouted. "They can't follow all of us." Samuel froze for half a second. Splitting meant risk, but staying together made them easier targets. He looked at Lila. He would not lose her in chaos. "We stay with you," he told Miriam firmly. The group veered sharply east into thicker woods, pushing through brush aggressively to create confusion in their trail. The sound of hunters crashing through the forest followed closely. The chase had begun again. Branches slapped against Samuel's face as he ran. His lungs burned. Lila struggled to keep pace, her smaller legs fighting to match his stride. "Faster!" Thomas urged from ahead. They reached a steep incline covered in loose rocks. Climbing it would slow them, but it would also make it harder for dogs to follow scent. Samuel lifted Lila into his arms and began climbing. Behind them, a hunter shouted, "They're heading up!" Gunshot cracked again, bullets striking rock near their feet. Miriam slipped and nearly fell backward, but Elijah grabbed her arm and pulled her upright. Samuel's muscles screamed as he climbed, but he didn't stop. At the top, they didn't pause. They ran down the other side, sliding through loose dirt. The forest thickened again. The barking grew faint. Finally, after what felt like endless running, the gunshots stopped. The hunters had lost visual contact, but they wouldn't stop searching. They never did. The group collapsed briefly behind a cluster of fallen trees, gasping for air. Lila was shaking violently. Samuel pulled her close. "You're safe," he whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure. Miriam's face was pale. "They were too prepared," she said quietly. "That wasn't random." Samuel looked at the others carefully. No one spoke for several seconds. Trust hung heavy in the air. Then Thomas said something that tightened Samuel's chest. "They knew about the bridge." Silence followed. Samuel replayed the last 24 hours in his mind. The cabin, the river split, the directions. Had the old woman betrayed them? Or had someone else been captured and forced to talk? The truth didn't matter right now. The hunters were learning their patterns. "We can't follow normal routes anymore," Samuel said firmly. "We change direction." Elijah nodded slowly. "Northwest, harder terrain, slower travel." "Safer," Samuel replied. Lila looked up at him quietly. "Are we going to make it?" He knelt in front of her, holding her face gently despite the chaos around them. "Yes," he said without hesitation, "because we don't stop." As evening approached, they moved cautiously through higher ground, avoiding obvious paths. The forest grew rockier, colder. Every sound felt amplified in the fading light. Samuel sensed something deeper now. This wasn't just a chase, it was becoming personal. Hunters didn't fire that aggressively for small rewards. Someone wanted them caught. As darkness settled, they reached a cliffside overlooking a wide valley below. In the far distance, faint lights flickered. Towns, civilization, perhaps even freedom. But between them and those lights lay open ground, and hunters who were growing smarter. Samuel stood at the cliff's edge, staring out into the night. He had sold himself once. He had escaped once. He had outrun death twice. But this journey was far from over. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, men with rifles still searched. Ahead of them lay the hardest stretch yet, and Samuel understood something clearly now. The closer they got to freedom, the more dangerous the world would become. He turned back to the group. "We move at first light," he said quietly, because stopping now was no longer an option.
A thin mist hovered over the valley below the cliff where they had rested. The distant lights they had seen during the night were gone now, replaced by quiet farmland and scattered buildings barely visible through morning fog. It looked peaceful, too peaceful. Samuel stood at the edge, scanning the land carefully. Open terrain stretched between them and the next tree line. Crossing it would mean exposure, but staying in the rocky high ground would slow them down, and the hunters were not far behind. "We go down," Elijah said quietly, fast and quiet. Samuel nodded, though unease twisted inside him. They descended carefully along the rocky slope, helping Leela navigate the uneven ground. Loose stones slid beneath their feet, sending small sounds into the still morning air. Every noise felt dangerous. Once they reached the valley floor, the group moved quickly through tall grass, staying low. The mist offered some cover, but not enough. Samuel's senses were heightened. Every bird taking flight made him tense. Halfway across the open stretch, the silence shattered. A sharp whistle echoed from the tree line ahead. Samuel froze. It wasn't a bird. It was a signal. Before he could react, men on horseback emerged from behind scattered trees, rifles raised. At the same time, shouting erupted behind them. Hunters had circled. "It's a trap!" Thomas shouted. Gunfire cracked across the valley. Grass exploded near their feet as bullets struck dirt. Samuel grabbed Leela and pulled her down flat. "They knew we'd come this way," Miriam breathed in shock. The hunters advanced steadily from both sides, tightening the circle. Samuel's mind raced. There was no forest to disappear into, no river to hide their scent, just open land and armed men. Elijah fired back with a small pistol he had been carrying secretly. The shot startled the nearest horse, causing it to rear violently. Chaos erupted for a brief second. "Run towards the old barn," Elijah yelled, pointing to a weathered wooden structure near the far edge of the valley. It was their only cover. Samuel lifted Leela and sprinted, bullets whizzing past. Thomas followed close behind, helping Miriam, who was struggling to keep pace. They reached the barn just as another volley of shots rang out. Samuel kicked the door open and shoved Leela inside. The others tumbled in seconds later, slamming the door shut. Inside was darkness and the smell of hay and dust. "Block it!" Thomas shouted. They dragged old crates and broken planks against the door as another bullet tore through the wood. "They'll surround us," Miriam said, panic rising in her voice. Samuel scanned the interior quickly. The barn had a loft above and a small rear window partially broken. "Up," he ordered, "into the loft." They climbed quickly using a narrow ladder. From above, Samuel could see through cracks in the walls. Hunters were positioning themselves carefully outside. "It's the end of the road," one voice called mockingly from outside. "Come out now and maybe we'll be merciful." Samuel felt Leela trembling beside him. "Stay quiet," he whispered. Another gunshot blasted through the door, splintering wood. Elijah's jaw tightened. They won't wait long. Smoke began seeping in. "They're setting it on fire," Miriam gasped. Samuel's heart pounded violently. Fire would force them out. He scanned desperately for another exit. The rear window. It was small, but maybe large enough for Leela. He crawled towards it and pushed against the old frame. The wood creaked loudly. Outside, flames licked up one side of the barn. "We don't have much time," Thomas coughed as smoke thickened. Samuel forced the frame open wider. "Leela," he said urgently, lifting her toward the opening. "You go first." Her eyes filled with fear. "What about you?" "I'm right behind you." He helped her squeeze through carefully. She dropped into tall grass behind the barn. "Run to the tree line and don't stop," he whispered fiercely. She hesitated. "Go," he ordered. She ran. Samuel turned back towards the others. Elijah shook his head. "We'll hold them." "No," Samuel said. "We go together." But another explosion of flames erupted below. The ladder caught fire.
Thomas pushed Miriam toward the window. "Move!" he shouted. One by one they squeezed out, coughing violently from smoke. Samuel was the last to exit. As he dropped down, flames burst through the barn roof, sending sparks into the sky. Hunters shouted as they realized their prey was escaping from the rear. Gunfire erupted again. Samuel sprinted towards the trees where he saw Leela's small figure running desperately. A bullet struck the ground near her foot, causing her to stumble and fall. Samuel felt time slow. He ran faster than he ever had before. Another shot rang out. Elijah cried out behind him. Samuel didn't look back. He reached Leela and lifted her into his arms, shielding her body with his own as he ran towards the forest. Miriam and Thomas were ahead now, firing back occasionally to slow the hunters. The tree line was only yards away, but it felt miles. Another bullet tore through Samuel's shoulder. Pain exploded through him, but he didn't fall. He couldn't. Not now. Not when they were so close. He gritted his teeth and kept moving. Finally, they crossed into the trees. The cover slowed the hunters' horses. Gunfire became less accurate. Samuel collapsed behind thick brush, breathing heavily. Blood soaked through his shirt. "Papa," Leela cried, her hands pressing against his wound. "It's nothing," he lied through clenched teeth. Thomas and Miriam crouched nearby, watching for pursuit. "They'll regroup," Thomas warned. "This isn't over." Samuel knew that, but something had changed. The hunters had tried everything: ambush, fire, bullets, and they were still alive. Barely, but alive. Leela's hands trembled as she tried to stop the bleeding. "You can't leave me," she whispered desperately. Samuel placed his uninjured hand gently over hers. "I didn't sell myself just to stop halfway," he said weakly. "We finish this." Through the trees, the valley below burned faintly where the barn had collapsed. Hunters shouted angrily in the distance, but they were no longer charging forward. The forest was dense again, harder terrain. Samuel leaned against the trunk of a tree, fighting dizziness. They had survived the trap, but at a cost. Blood loss would slow him, and winter air was growing colder. Still, beyond the forest ahead, the north waited. Freedom was closer than ever before, and Samuel understood one final truth as he forced himself to stand again. Every step forward now would demand everything he had left.
The forest opened into a narrow valley, cold mist curling over the uneven ground. Samuel carried Leela carefully, her small arms clinging to him as they advanced silently. Behind them, the remnants of the hunters' pursuit were barely audible, distant shouts, occasional barking, but he knew they were still being hunted. Each step felt heavier than the last. His shoulder throbbed, his wound soaked his shirt, yet the fear in Leela's eyes drove him forward faster than exhaustion allowed. Miriam, Elijah, and Thomas followed closely, moving cautiously through the dense trees. The air smelled of wet earth, smoke from the burned barn lingering faintly in the breeze. Every sound seemed magnified: the drip of water from leaves, a bird startled by movement, a branch snapping underfoot. "You're doing well," whispered Samuel to Leela, trying to mask the pain in his voice. "We're almost there." She looked up at him with wide eyes. "Papa, how much farther?" He hesitated. He didn't know exactly. The woman who had guided them had given directions to a river north that would lead them to safety, but every twist of the forest brought new dangers. Still, he could not admit uncertainty to her. "Not far. Keep moving." They continued, crossing shallow streams and scaling small ridges. Hunger gnawed at them all, but there was no time to rest. The closer they moved to freedom, the greater the risk of being caught. The forest offered cover, but it also hid unknown threats, hidden hunters, treacherous terrain, and the ever-present uncertainty of survival. By mid-afternoon, the group approached the northern river, its waters rushing with icy speed. Samuel's heart leapt at the sight. The river was their path, their hope. If they could follow it, they could reach states where freedom awaited, where chains would no longer bind them. "Stay close," Samuel instructed. Leela's small hand squeezed his tightly as they navigated the slippery riverbank. The current was swift, and the rocks beneath their feet were slick with rain and moss. One wrong step could mean disaster. As they moved, Samuel noticed subtle signs of human presence: broken branches, footprints partially washed away, remnants of campfires long extinguished. Someone had passed through here recently. It could be a friend, or it could be another trap. He could not risk guessing. Suddenly, Leela slipped on a wet rock. Samuel caught her just in time, her face pale with fright. "It's okay," he whispered, holding her close. "I've got you." Behind them, Thomas motioned silently to be extra alert. They had all learned to communicate in whispers and gestures. Words were dangerous. Any sound could alert the hunters still searching for them. They followed the river for hours, moving carefully along its winding course. The forest began to thin, revealing glimpses of open land and distant settlements. Freedom was near, yet danger remained omnipresent. Samuel's shoulder burned with pain, each step a reminder of the cost of their escape. By evening, the group approached the small clearing. The forest opened to reveal a faint dirt road leading toward the north. Samuel paused, studying the path. It seemed empty, but he knew better. Hunters could be anywhere, hiding, waiting. Miriam knelt beside him. "We must move quickly. The road is a risk, but faster than the forest at this point." Samuel nodded. He turned to Leela. "Hold my hand and don't let go." They stepped onto the dirt road cautiously, moving as silently as possible. Every snap of a twig or crunch of gravel underfoot made Samuel flinch, but each step also brought them closer to freedom. As night approached, the forest on either side of the road seemed to darken, shadows stretching like fingers across their path. The moon rose slowly, casting pale light that glimmered off the river they had left behind. Suddenly, a distant shout echoed through the trees. Samuel froze. The hunters had not given up. He grabbed Leela, pressing her against his chest. "They're still following," he whispered, "but we can't stop now." The group increased their pace, moving like ghosts through the darkening forest. Samuel's mind raced. Every step had to be precise. One misstep could cost everything. Hours later, they reached another river crossing, a small wooden footbridge barely holding together. Samuel inspected it quickly. It would have to do. There was no alternative. One by one, they crossed carefully. Leela went first, then Miriam, then Thomas, then Elijah. Samuel brought up the rear, ensuring no one was left behind. Each creak of the bridge made his heart pound. As they reached the other side, Samuel looked back at the path they had taken. Every mile had been a struggle, every step a test of courage. He was covered in mud, soaked from the river and rain, and his shoulder throbbed with pain. Yet he was alive. Leela was alive. They had survived. But the journey was not over. Freedom still lay ahead, and the hunters would not stop easily. They pressed on through the night, moving with renewed determination. Leela's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but she did not complain. Samuel whispered stories of the world beyond the forests, of towns where children could learn, of streets where no chains awaited. Each word was a promise, a vision of hope. By the early morning hours, they reached the edge of the forest. The trees opened to reveal farmland stretching for miles, and Samuel could see faint lights from distant houses. They were close, close enough to smell hope. But Samuel knew better than to relax. The final stretch would test them the most. Open fields meant exposure, no cover, and hunters might still lie in wait. He held Leela's hand tightly. "Almost there," he whispered, "just a little further." The group advanced cautiously, moving through the shadows. Samuel scanned every movement, every sound. The danger was real, but so was their determination. They crossed the last stretch of forest, finally emerging onto a narrow dirt road that led towards freedom. Samuel felt a surge of relief, tempered with caution. The road was not safe yet, but it was closer than they had ever been. As they walked, Samuel thought about the sacrifices made, the dangers faced, and the hope that had kept them alive. He glanced at Leela, whose eyes reflected a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and the first spark of hope. For the first time since the escape began, Samuel allowed himself a small smile. They had survived the forest, the hunters, the traps, and the storms.
And now the final journey awaited, one step at a time, towards freedom, towards safety, and towards a life they had fought so hard to claim. He tightened his grip on Leela. "We keep going," he said, "no matter what." And with that, they stepped forward, into the unknown, guided by courage, love, and the unbreakable bond between a father and his daughter.
The dirt road stretched ahead, pale under the early morning sun. Every step Samuel took was careful, deliberate, yet the pain in his shoulder reminded him of the cost they had already paid. Leela walked beside him, holding his hand tightly, still small and fragile, but her eyes carried a courage beyond her years. "Papa," she whispered, "are we really going to be free?" Samuel glanced down at her, his chest tightening. Freedom was more than a word. It was a promise he had fought to keep. "Yes, Leela, we are almost there, just a little further," he said, trying to sound certain, even though the forest, the valley, the rivers, and the hunters had tested him beyond measure. Behind them, Miriam, Elijah, and Thomas moved quietly. Exhaustion was evident on their faces, but determination burned brighter than ever. They had shared the same fear, the same hope, the same desperate fight for survival. And now, as the open fields approached, they knew the final test awaited. The farmland stretched endlessly, dotted with distant houses, fences, and faint signs of life. The sight of people moving about brought a flicker of hope, but also tension. Hunters could be anywhere, disguised as laborers, hidden among the shadows, waiting to capture the escapees before they could claim their freedom. Samuel kept moving, scanning constantly. He adjusted the grip on Leela, ensuring her safety as they approached the road leading to the nearest settlement. Each step was measured, each breath calculated. Their journey had been long, grueling, and unforgiving, yet every obstacle had brought them closer. Suddenly, a figure appeared ahead, blocking the road. Samuel's heart stopped for a fraction of a second. A man on horseback, rifle in hand, eyes scanning for movement. The hunters had found them again. "Stay calm," Samuel whispered to Leela. He lifted her slightly, shielding her from view. The horse's horse shifted nervously. He called out in a sharp voice, "Stop. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." Samuel swallowed the fear rising in his throat. Every instinct screamed to run, but the open road offered no cover. Leela trembled against him, her grip tight, her eyes wide with terror. "Go slowly," Samuel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We don't want trouble." The man on horseback hesitated, then motioned forward. Another figure emerged behind him, also armed. Samuel realized they were outnumbered and exposed. A trap. "Papa," Leela whispered, clinging to him. "I know," he replied, whispering so only she could hear. "I won't let them take us." Then Samuel made a decision, one that would define everything. He shifted his stance, holding Leela close to him. "Run toward the tree line," he yelled suddenly, voice firm, commanding. "Go, now!" Leela's eyes widened, confusion and fear mixing with trust. She ran, following the direction of the trees, Miriam and the others right behind her. Samuel stayed back, turning to face the hunters. "Come and get me if you dare," he shouted, his voice carrying both challenge and desperation. The hunters hesitated for a moment, unsure what to do. Samuel raised his hands, not to surrender, but to draw attention, making himself the target. A gamble, a father's sacrifice. Gunshots erupted. Samuel ducked, rolled, and continued forward, drawing the hunter's fire toward himself and away from the children. The pain in his shoulder screamed through him, but he refused to fall. Each step brought him closer to giving Leela the chance to reach safety. From the tree line, Leela watched in terror and awe. Her father had always been strong, but this was courage beyond words. She felt the weight of every second, knowing his sacrifice was keeping her alive. Elijah and Thomas fought alongside Samuel, buying time. Miriam guided Leela and the younger children, pushing them toward the hidden paths that would lead to freedom. Bullets struck close, sparks flying against rocks and dirt. Samuel felt his strength waning, every movement heavier than the last. Yet the thought of Leela, of her small, trusting face, of the life he had sold himself to preserve, kept him moving. Finally, Leela reached the first safe clearing, glimpsing the distant settlement. She didn't stop. She ran faster than she ever had before, knowing instinctively that this was the moment her father had prepared her for. Samuel, bleeding and exhausted, glanced back. He saw her disappear into the distant trees with Miriam and the others. Relief surged, mixed with agony. He had given everything to ensure she lived, and now it was almost over. The hunters advanced, but Samuel did not falter. Every ounce of energy, every shred of pain was irrelevant. He was a father, a protector. Hours later, after the battle for survival had passed, Leela reached a safe house in the northern state. The women inside embraced her immediately, shielding her from the world outside. She collapsed to the floor, sobbing, exhausted and terrified. "They're alive," someone whispered. "Yes," Leela whispered back. My father kept us safe." And then she realized the fight, the journey, the fear, the sacrifice had led her here. She was free. She had survived. And somewhere behind her, in the forest, a father had given everything to ensure that. Samuel emerged from the shadows much later, weak and bloodied, but alive. The hunters had given up, assuming the family was lost in the maze of forest and rivers. He limped toward the safe house, each step a testament to endurance, love, and unbreakable will. When Leela finally saw him again, she ran into his arms. Tears flowed freely. Samuel held her tightly, whispering apologies and promises all at once. "You're safe now," he said, his voice hoarse. "We're free." The journey had ended, but the story of courage, love, and sacrifice would live forever in their hearts. They had survived slavery, hunters, and the wilderness. They had endured storms, traps, and near death. And most importantly, they had each other. Freedom had a price, but Samuel had paid it. And now the reward was Leela's life, her laughter, her future. And in that moment, as the sun rose higher over the northern lands, Samuel understood the truth that had guided him through every nightmare. Love, courage, and sacrifice were stronger than chains, stronger than fear, stronger than any hunter. And the bond between a father and a child could overcome anything.